Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're getting into a really personal exploration of the journey of Seth Andrews. He went from being this devout, fundamentalist, Christian, even a religious radio host, to becoming, well, a major voice for reasoned non-belief.
And this really isn't just a personal story. What we're looking at in these sources is more like a surgical dissection of fundamentalist culture. Andrews goes through and just meticulously challenges the core structures that held his world together.
The psychological tools, the social pressures.
The logical fallacies, all of it.
Right. So for you listening, our goal here is to really understand the mechanics of it. How did this architecture of fear and shame, built layer by layer from childhood, create such an inescapable framework? And more importantly, what were the specific evidence-based challenges that were finally strong enough to bring that whole system down? We're really getting into the weeds of deconversion here.
I think we have to begin where his experience began, right? With childhood indoctrination. He speaks about this concept, the edge of accountability, and it's chilling.
It is. The idea that children, as young as 4 years old?
As young as 4, yeah. Were deemed fully responsible for their eternal fate. I mean, that's not spiritual guidance. That's just immediate, intense psychological pressure.
And he makes a key point about the fear of hell. It wasn't just presented as, cosmic justice. He saw it as a form of psychological abuse, but one that was very cleverly disguised.
How so?
Well, the pastors and mentors would frame this chamber of horrors as something God designed almost reluctantly.
So God had to be just, even though it broke his heart to send anyone there.
Exactly. He calls it a clever little sleight of hand. It positions God not as the architect of the terror, but as this heartbroken victim of his own unbreakable rules.
And that just puts all the guilt, all the responsibility right back on the child for simply existing.
So if hell is the foundation, the rapture was like the constant immediate threat hanging over your head. I really want to talk about the media he mentions, like the film A Thief in the Night.
Oh, yeah. The sources make it clear how profoundly disturbing those films were for kids. It wasn't just the idea of people vanishing, it was the imagery they used.
So visceral.
Totally. Cheap sets, but terrifying visuals designed for one thing: immediate obedience. You had these oppressive military roundups, the Mark of the Beast, 666, and these really graphic executions by guillotine.
And we have to linger on that detail, the guillotine, because we're talking about explicit images of severed heads, bloody white robes, and this was shown to children and teenagers over and over.
When your whole worldview is enforced by the threat of decapitation, I mean, it's no wonder he says it kept him in lockstep with the culture.
Absolutely. And that level of fear, it just breeds this hyper-paranoid culture where suddenly threats are lurking everywhere.
Even in the most innocuous things, it stops being about theology and starts being about constant vigilance.
Let's give some of those examples because they really show how absurd the paranoia got. He mentions the panic around music, right?
Yeah.
The devil's chord.
Yeah, the tritone interval. Just because it sounded unsettling, it was labeled satanic. Or the rules about games. It's fascinating.
The dice.
The dice! A normal 6-sided die for a board game was fine, but a 12-sided die for Dungeons and Dragons, that was a conduit for demons. It shows the fear wasn't based on function, but on these arbitrary symbolic associations.
He even talks about buying a simple souvenir, a little cotton-stuffed voodoo doll, and the genuine fear it caused in his religious friends.
Even though they knew it was just a trinket.
Right. And that really proved the point for him. Despite all the talk about love and joy, the culture he grew up in was really driven by an engine of perpetual fear. Fear of God, fear of the devil, and maybe most of all, fear of being kicked out.
And that engine of fear, it always channels into social control. Which brings us to purity culture, which, as he describes it, focused its shame almost entirely on women.
He gives that vivid example from his high school. The ban on blue jeans for girls.
The logic there is just, it's amazing. On one hand, jeans were banned for being too alluring, too sexually distracting.
An instrument of lust, basically.
Right. But then on certain days, they were given out as a special celebratory perk.
On Jeans Day. So, which is it? Are they temptation or reward?
The rules were totally inconsistent, but the application of those rules, that was precise and gendered. He talks about measuring skirt length with military precision.
A constant vigilance, but only applied to the girls.
Exactly. It creates this atmosphere where women are seen as inherently, the temptation that needs to be controlled.
And this was all backed up by Scripture, which placed the blame squarely on women. They were appointed the gatekeepers for sexual purity.
Yeah, the sources cite references that portray women as sirens, like the woman in Proverbs dressed as a prostitute.
And then you have the idea of thought crime from Matthew 5.28, that just looking at a woman with lust is adultery of the heart.
Right, and while that sounds like it's condemning the man's thoughts, the way it played out socially was that the woman had to bear the burden of preventing that thought crime in the first place.
By dressing modestly, by not being a temptation, it's an incredible burden of guilt to place on someone.
And that guilt-shame feedback loop, it just peaks with rituals like the purity balls, where you have preteens and teenagers pledging sexual fidelity to their fathers.
The language used there is so loaded.
Incredibly loaded, emphasizing female dependence, warning that promiscuity will destroy their lives. The tragic consequence, as Andrew saw it, was that this created a rush toward premature, often unstable marriages.
All based on that biblical command that it's better to marry than to burn with passion.
They were just trying to escape the shame. They weren't ready for marriage.
But the real kicker, and the ultimate irony here, was just how ineffective the whole system was.
Oh, completely. This sex-obsessed culture, designed to control sexuality, just produced the opposite result. He cites these powerful statistics, Bible Belt states leading the nation in teen pregnancies.
And high rates of pornography use in places like Utah.
Right. The intense repression didn't control sex. It just fostered this underlying widespread obsession with it. The system just failed on its own terms.
So that kind of social control, it has to be propped up by some kind of intellectual defense.
Mm-hmm.
Which brings us to the next theme, the problems with Christian apologetics.
Yeah, the intellectual inconsistencies that started to create cracks in his belief system. And he starts with a really strange one, what he calls the cannibalism ritual. Communion.
The intellectual hurdle there is the difference between denominations, right?
Exactly. For Protestants, it's a symbolic cracker and juice. But for Catholics, the doctrine of transubstantiation says it's a literal transformation into the physical body and blood of Christ.
But a transformation that is conveniently, chemically, and physically undetectable.
Right. The bread has absolutely no material properties of flesh and blood. It's a claim of a miracle that is, by its very nature, unfalsifiable.
He even mentions that DNA study done on consecrated wafers.
By the aliens.
Yeah.
All people. And what did they find?
Nothing. Just DNA from normal human handling. It just shows how far faith has to bend to accommodate ritual, especially when it's faced with just basic scientific scrutiny.
And that selective acceptance, it applies directly to the Bible itself, the biblical barbarism. Andrews details all these horrifying stories that believers just have to actively ignore or explain away to maintain this view of a benevolent God.
We're not just talking about minor things. We're talking about God commanding genocide. The sources mention putting men, women, teenagers, and even infants to the edge of the sword at Jericho.
Or the laws themselves. The law that a rapist must marry his victim.
Or God killing a man just for picking up twigs on the Sabbath. It's in Numbers 15. The contradiction is just profound. Believers hold the Bible up as the perfect moral guide, yet it's filled with things they'd condemn in any modern leader.
Which leads to what he calls the critical domino effect. If the foundational stories in Genesis, Adam and Eve, original sin, if those are unproven, or even just allegorical.
And then the entire Jesus narrative, which is based on the need for a blood atonement for that original sin.
It just collapses. The whole structure vanishes if that first domino falls.
And he proved that so many American Christians, as he puts it, believe, but they do not know. He talks about how most believers can't even name 7 of the 10 commandments.
But they'll advocate for them as the foundation of a moral life while living in, practical ignorance of what they actually are.
So why does God need so many human defenders? That was his critique of apologetics.
Exactly. The whole practice suggests that God can't explain or defend himself, so he needs humans to do these logical gymnastics for him.
And the rationalizations are always the same. You've got the circular argument quoting the Bible to prove the Bible.
Or the classic, God works in mysterious ways, which is really just an admission that God intentionally confuses us, so we're forced to rely on blind faith.
But the ultimate tactic is just cherry picking.
Right. If a verse is plausible, it's literal. If it's supernatural, it's a miracle or a metaphor. If it's just plain weird, it's mysterious.
And if it's horrifying, like the genocide,
then it's either mistranslated or it's, outdated. It's a defense mechanism designed not to find truth, but to protect a predetermined conclusion.
That system of excuses leads us perfectly into the next big idea, what Andrews called the God of diminishing returns.
It's such a great phrase.
Yeah.
You contrast these massive miracles from the past, like parting the Red Sea 5,000 years ago.
With the modern miracles.
Yeah, the bar for divine action has dropped alarmingly low. God went from stopping armies and rewriting physics to, appearing on a piece of burnt toast.
And this is where the Bob's Bicycle story comes in. It's just perfect. This $2,000 bike gets stolen during a prayer breakfast.
Okay.
5 months later, the guy's diligent, non-praying wife finds the bike for sale on Facebook Marketplace. And this was hailed as a praise Jesus miracle.
Wow. So the miracle wasn't just that the bike was found, but that God orchestrated a Facebook Marketplace listing.
Exactly. And the irony is, it ignores the human effort of the wife, and it ignores the moral implications. The creator of the universe is ignoring global suffering, but this specific bike was his priority, and Andrews got hostility for even questioning that.
And that desperation to find a miracle, it shows up even in real tragedy. He talks about Bibles surviving deadly tornadoes in places like Cookeville and Moore, Oklahoma.
Including the Bible of a woman, Cindy Plumley, who died in the wreckage.
And the comfort that was offered was it was bizarre. The focus was all on the intact Bibles, not the dead people.
He quotes the sentiment as, "Sorry about your dead mother, but here are some nice pieces of paper." It's just this desperate need to find divine favor, even if it means prioritizing an object over a human life.
We see that same pattern with medical intervention. The prayer to guide the hands of the surgeon.
As if that one prayer outweighs the decades of education, training, and testing that the surgeon went through to get that skill.
And the science on this is fascinating. He references that Harvard study on intercessory prayer for cardiac patients.
What were the findings there?
Well, the patients who knew they were being prayed for actually fared almost 10% worse than the others.
Worse.
Worse. The suggestion is that knowing you're on a prayer list adds a layer of performance anxiety and stress that leads to complications. The data just flatly contradicts the claim.
So all of this non-intervention, it all came to a head for him with 9/11 one. He calls it the giant flashing zero. Why was that the final break?
Because in that crisis, God was a complete non-participant. The attack was planned by humans, the rescue was executed by humans, the solutions were all human-driven. There was no divine intervention, just human heroism and human engineering.
But the final straw was what the faith leaders said afterwards.
That was the ultimate offense. You had people like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson claiming God lifted the curtain and allowed the attacks because of American wickedness.
Blaming it on abortion and homosexuals.
They completely diverted the blame for the tragedy onto marginalized groups, instead of addressing the glaring absence of the supposedly all-powerful, all-loving being they preach about. For Andrews, that was the moment he knew the entire system was intellectually and morally bankrupt.
So the intellectual dam finally broke. And it happened for him in 2008 watching a debate. He calls it the Hitch Slap.
Yeah, he was watching Christopher Hitchens debate Rabbi Shmuley Boteach, and the moment of clarity came when the rabbi used the Hitler grenade.
Trying to discredit Darwin by comparing his philosophy to Hitler's.
Exactly. And Andrews immediately saw that for what it was, the desperate flailing of drowning credibility. It's a tactic you use when you can't engage with the actual argument.
So that exposure to evidence-based thinkers like Hitchens and Dawkins, that was the key.
It was crucial. It introduced him to a whole new system of thinking, scientific, and philosophical reasoning that was just superior to faith because it requires evidence and it welcomes scrutiny.
He came to see faith as, what, an intellectual cop-out.
An excuse for laziness, yeah, like driving with your eyes closed. His logic was simple. If God created the human mind with reason and curiosity, why would he then make himself undetectable to that very mind? It just didn't make sense.
And that led him to start the thinking atheist. He decided to use his own skills as the storyteller to push back.
Right. He saw it as a responsibility. He felt he needed to perform restitution for wrongdoing, for all the years he spent promoting unreason on the radio.
So after this whole journey, what's the big takeaway? His final conclusion is pretty powerful, especially for our time.
It's that in the age of information, ignorance is no longer an excuse. It's a choice.
The answers are seconds away.
Exactly. We have to embrace difficult truth over what he calls lazy fantasy. Why rely on the flawed ideas of ancient ancestors when we have the intellectual lecture hall of the entire world in our pockets?
And we should be grateful for the human accomplishments that give us that breathtaking view of a better world. Things like the Hubble telescope, vaccines, GPS, these are all testaments to human reason, not divine intervention.
It's really a story about shifting from the psychological bondage of fear and purity culture to the clarity that you can find in skepticism and evidence. It just underscores how important it is to challenge your own inherent beliefs, no matter how comforting they might seem at first.
So here's a final thought. If religion is often seen as this coping mechanism for a chaotic world, how might actively participating in discovery, scientific, intellectual, personal, actually provide a deeper, more sustainable sense of fulfillment than just waiting for a divine rescue? We'd encourage you to think about what personal mysteries in your own life could be solved by embracing a little honest skepticism.